Good day, class. This is Dr. Frizzell, and today we're going to be talking about general principles that underlie sensation and perception. In its simplest form, the way that we want to think about the connection between sensation and perception is the underlying focus of this entire course. As you can see here, we have three different parts of this basic model. One being the stimulus, which means the objects in our outside world that create some sort of either photons that might enter our eye or some type of microorganism that might be creating a certain type of smell, like fragments of a rose bush or grass clippings, things like that. Also, different things that might touch us or sound waves. That would be a stimulus that comes from the outside world. The second part of this relationship is our neural response, meaning what is it that our brain is doing to interpret that information? Not making sense of that information, but interpret that information, meaning is the brain receiving signals from the eye? Is the brain receiving signals from some other part of the body or from the ears? And so forth. What is the brain and the rest of the neurological system doing in response to that stimuli? The third part of this model has to do with our perceptual response. The perception has to deal with the mind's ability to understand what that experience is. And that's why on the right-hand side here, we have the subjective experience, meaning when we have something that we see or hear, how do we know what that is? It's our mind making sense out of our response to the environmental stimuli. If you take a look at this three-way relationship, this is going to break down a little bit about how these different relationships exist in the bigger picture of subsciences in psychology and other fields. So for example, when we're looking at the relationship between how stimuli from our environment interacts with the brain itself or the neurological system at large, what we're really studying here is neuroscience, meaning what kind of stimulus leads to what type of neural response. Is the stimulus causing the brain to have an excitatory response or a sedating response or some other type of response? That's what neuroscience focuses on. On the other hand, how our brain understands this information on a neurological level and sends those signals over to our mind in a cerebral cortex for being able to understand what this information is and how we interpret those experiences, that has to do with our consciousness. So as you can imagine, the brain is doing a lot of different things at once, trying to process all the stimuli from our environment. And there might be some things happening that break into our consciousness that we have to pay attention to, like maybe a really bad odor or a really bright light. And so our mind is going to make sense of those experiences. But then again, there are probably some experiences that we're not going to be paying attention to or that we're not completely aware of, or maybe sometimes that we're not aware of at all. And that is the mind's ability to suppress information that is coming from the brain, or it discounts that information as not important. The third part of this relationship has to do with psychophysics. That's the relationship between environmental stimuli and how our mind interprets what that stimuli is without the actual neurological response. But as you can see, all three of these different parts are interconnected. The most basic way to understand how this information gets from point A to point B to point C is to examine it in the hierarchical process. First, we take a look at how a sensory organ, which can be any type of sensation in the body, meaning tactile, things touching the hairs on your head or hairs on your arm or your skin, for example. Maybe when you're driving in a convertible, the wind hitting your eyes or sounds entering your ears. Those are your sensory organs. And what we consider is that there are 5 basic senses, meaning seeing, which is visual, hearing, which is auditory, smelling, which is olfactory, sensing on the skin or on the outside touch sensation, which is tactile, and then the last being taste, which is gustatory. So in all of these sensory organs, they all have receptors that receive the specific types of information. For example, there are specialized cells in the eyes that receive light energy in the form of photons, that our eyes are able to pick up that energy and in those certain forms of light and be able to interpret that in a certain way that sends information on a biochemical level to our intermediate neurons. Our intermediate neurons will then send the information to a centralized part of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is in the deepest part of the brain called the limbic system. If you have already heard about that from your intro psych class or maybe from physiological psychology, you'll recall what the thalamus is. It's sort of like your relay station for the brain. Not all information goes through the thalamus, but the vast majority of it does. And that is sort of a decision-making station and a way station for redirecting certain types of sensory information to other parts of the brain. That's what we refer to as the sensory pathway. So sometimes there are multiple steps that have to occur in order for that information to be transferred from the sensory organs, then it goes through the way station of the thalamus, and then into other parts of the brain so that we can actually understand in our mind what the subjective experience is. And that's where the last part comes into play, which is cortical processing. After that information is sent from the thalamus, it enters primary cortex, secondary cortex, and higher cortex, which are basically the gray matter of our brain and the more advanced parts of our mind that most animals don't have, at least not on the same level as a human being does. And that sensory information is processed in increasingly complex ways. So not only is, say, for example, some type of light being received into the eye, then it's being transferred into the way station of the brain to be transferred somewhere else. And then we might recognize an image through our primary cortex. Our secondary cortex may say, okay, that's what this object is. Is it something familiar? Is it something that is safe? Is it something that is dangerous? Is it something that I've never seen before? Is it enjoyable to look at? Is it awful to look at? And that's where our higher cortex comes into play so that we can start forming judgments and stereotypes and all kinds of other higher order processes, like, is this an important stimulus for us to think about? Or do I need to remember this type of stimulus so that I don't come into contact with it again? So as you can see, there is a hierarchical process. It starts at the very most essential receptor level where some type of energy or some type of stimulus is reaching our receptors, either through our eyes, nose, mouth, on our skin, for example. It enters a neurological pathway, gets into the most essential and basic, oldest parts of our brain, and then it's sent to the more complex areas of our brain for processing and understanding. So here's a great diagram of the human brain. And if you're not sure quite how to orient to which way the brain is facing, one easy way to look at that is to look for where the cerebellum is. And this little grainy looking stripy piece down here in the bottom next to where it says human, that's the cerebellum. And that's always going to be in the back underside of the brain. So this would be the back of the head here. On the front end of the brain, you're going to notice that there is no cerebellum. There's kind of an empty space right here. And that's just for purposes of showing you what the brain looks like without the sensory organs attached to it. So what we would see here, if we actually took apart a human head, we would see the eyes in this area, and then we would see the human ears in this area. Hopefully you guys can see the mouse arrow moving around as I'm pointing to it. So if you take a look at the highlighted areas of the brain, what you're going to notice is that the different areas of the brain are responsible for processing this different sensory information. So for example, if you look at this light blue area right here in the front of the brain, it's kind of underneath that little edge right there. That's the olfactory area, which means that's the area that is responsible for processing information about the things that we smell. So, for example, we might smell something pleasant, like really nice fragrance, flowers, or something like that. And as we smell that, this is the primary processing area of the brain that's going to be responsible for interpreting what that is and whether or not we need to be averted to it or maybe that we enjoy it. And so if we look at the black area right here in the middle, this is actually part of the temporal lobe. Sometimes it's hard to taste things without smelling them first, because these two areas are actually linked. And we can't get into that for this slide, but you might want to pocket that information for later. The gustatory area is an important part of the brain that helps us to sense what it is that we're tasting. So if you can imagine, there are people out there who have a lesion or a localized damage to the gustatory area of the brain, and they can't taste anything. They might be able to smell food because the olfactory area of the brain is working okay. But once that food goes into their mouth and they chew it up and swallow it, they never get a chance to really taste it. So how bad would that experience be? I think that would suck. So moving on, this pink area here on the top of the brain is what we call the somatosensory area. This is more responsible for interpreting the things that we touch. So for example, if you grab a cup of coffee from Starbucks and there's not one of those little wrap things around it, and you grab it and you notice that it's really hot, that's actually the somatosensory area of the brain receiving that information very quickly to help you know that something is touching your hand and that it's hot. Also, you can feel the wind blowing on your skin, or you can feel the sun hitting your face. Those are all things that are going to be processed in the somatosensory cortex area. Moving on also into the back of the brain here, you're going to notice this kind of olive green color area back here. This is the visual cortex. And I think this is probably one of the strangest things that we know about the brain, is that the visual area of the brain that is the primary processing area is actually in the back of the head as opposed to the front. So one of the things that you guys might want to consider is maybe asking yourself the question, what is the evolutionary advantage or the biological advantage of having a visual area that's in the back of the head as opposed to the front? Because if you think about it, if the human eye is in the front of the brain and the visual cortex area was in the front of the brain as well, then that would be the shortest distance between two pieces, right? It would kind of make sense that those would be next to each other, but that's actually not the case. What actually happens, and we'll get into this in one of the later chapters, is that information will enter the eye, light energy will enter the eye, that information will be processed through the primary optic pathway, and that information will be translated through a pathway that goes all the way through the brain to the back. And that information is sort of interpreted and processed in this back area. So I want you guys to think about that and consider why you think that might be. Finally, in this last piece right here, you'll notice that there's a dark blue area right there called the vestibular area. And what the vestibular area does is it measures where your body is in space, and it also helps to keep track of your balance. So people that have damage to the vestibular area or have a vestibular disorder, you'll notice that these people oftentimes tend to trip and fall a lot. They get dizzy a lot. Sometimes this area can be thrown out of whack if there's a really bad concussion or a traumatic brain injury. And then in some cases, there are individuals that have a brain defect where this area is not functioning correctly. And these people have to use like a walker or a wheelchair, not because they can't physically stand, it's because when they do stand or sit upright, they get extremely dizzy and fall over, and it makes them nauseated. So the vestibular area is actually connected in some way to the visual and also to the auditory area right here, which is the area of the brain that correctly interprets the information that's coming from your ears. So if you notice, in contrast to how the visual sensation area, the visual processing area is in the back of the brain, it's the farthest point from the eyes, the auditory actually is right next to your ear. The pathway from all of the internal parts of the ear, if you remember all the little micro bones that are inside of your ear and your eardrum and that whole canal system, that connects to the auditory area in a very short area right there. So these three areas are actually interconnected because if you've ever been on a ride or a roller coaster, for example, that might go upside down or have really rapid twists and things like that, what that does is it messes with your visual system and your vestibular system, and that's why sometimes people get dizzy and sick riding on certain kinds of rides, because their mind can't comprehend that kind of information, and so it throws everything out of whack. Pretty interesting stuff. Okay, so here we have the logic of the brain organization. The question here is, why does each sensory pathway reach the cortex in its particular location for the primary stage of processing? So again, here we're looking at a brain that's oriented to the left. This is the back of the brain where the cerebellum is, and it's the same thing here on the right photo, even though, or I guess it's not a photo, it's an illustration. But if you look, it's the same orientation. So this blue part is the frontal lobe. That's where a lot of the information processing part of our mind is. Higher order processes like decision making, memory is highly tied to the frontal lobe. Information processing like detailed analysis, memory, attention, concentration, those higher order processes are there. If you compare a human brain to a brain of an animal or even to some degree a primate, what you're going to see is the same basic structure for the most part, but what you're going to see is that this frontal lobe has significantly less mass in those animals than it does in humans. And that's one of the reasons why human beings have so much of an intellectual advantage over most animals, is because our frontal lobe has just a greater operating capacity. And so as you look at this also, you'll notice that the side part of the brain here is called the temporal lobe. Some of the speech and to some degree memory as well, but also auditory interpretation are all directly tied to this. So if a person has some damage to the temporal lobe, depending on where it is, we can see some deficits in their ability to form words. We see some difficulty in their ability to initiate speech, or sometimes they might try to say something, but the words come out jumbled. Excuse me, that's a really important area of the brain for communication. And so if a person has a stroke or some other type of brain injury, and they're having difficulty speaking, this might be one of the areas where we would look for some damage. Same thing here for the parietal lobe. This is more for sensing information in our environment from tactile, but also other information. This would be the part of the brain that if there was some damage there, we might have difficulty being able to move, because what's not shown in this graphic is that the parietal lobe, this very front part of it right here, is responsible for being able to orient your body. So if you have damage in that area, chances are you would not be able to move certain parts of your body, or they would be not within your control, meaning like your muscles might be contracting and you wouldn't be able to let them go. And this is something I've personally seen working in university hospitals. When people have a stroke in this area, this part of the brain is no longer able to function correctly. And you might see people where their arms or hands or other body parts are kind of twisted in a contorted position, and they just simply can't let go because their brain will not let them. So moving on to the occipital lobe, again, as we said earlier in the previous slide, this is where a lot of the visual information is processed and understood. You can compare and contrast this graphic on the right side with the graphic on the left side, and you can kind of see where in the deeper structures of the brain where this information really is processed. And in this very farthest left portion, what you can see here is that in the visual cortex in the back of the brain, this actually goes pretty deep into the brain. So there would have to be some pretty significant massive damage to the back of the head to sustain enough damage to completely ruin one's vision, but there are cases in which that can happen. Same thing is in the front, the olfactory sensation. If you see that little tiny piece of the brain sticking out there, that's what we call the olfactory bulb. That information, that's the kind of entry point where information from the nose is sent neurologically directly into the brain. And so that's where the information for smell can come in. Again, when we were talking earlier about balance being part of the vestibular system, you can kind of see that there. It's more on the outside of the brain as opposed to the inner core area. And in this cutaway area, you can also see how the somatosensation part of the brain is more, it's deeper than it looks, I guess is one way to say it. If you look at the outside of the brain, it's like a strip is going on the outside of the brain here, but that strip is actually much deeper than it looks. It's actually an entire cross section of the gray matter of the brain right there. Again, really fascinating stuff. Okay, so we're not going to spend too much time talking about this slide. I just wanted to show it to you to kind of give you an idea of what the cross sections of the brain look like. And as you can see from the previous slide, there are different sections of the brain, the 4 different lobes. But in addition to the 4 different lobes, what you're going to notice, this section right here is if you did a cross section of the brain where it was cut down the middle from front to back. So if you separated the front half of the brain and the back half of the brain right through the middle, what you would see is you would see this central fissure right here, this kind of division between a person's right side of the brain as they're looking straight at us. This is the right side of the brain, and this is actually the left side of the brain. And you'll notice that there's little pockets of fluid in the middle. That's for cerebrospinal fluid to help process some of the neurochemicals in our brain and to help recycle all those and repackage them so that our brain can use and reuse the same biochemical markers over and over again. And then you'll notice at the bottom here is the brainstem. If you look on the right, you can kind of see how our brain is sort of held up and sits atop of the brainstem and the spinal cord. In this figure on the left, it's a little bit more cut off. And what you're going to see also is this very center part of the brain where the thalamus is, and to some degree where the amygdala is. The amygdala is part of the brain that is responsible for mood and emotional control, among other things. But you'll notice that this central part of the brain is what older psychologists like myself call the old brain. And what that refers to is this is the part of the brain that pretty much every mammalian species or animal has. And then as the animal is more evolved and more intelligent, then we start to see increasing amounts of cerebral cortex. And as we talked about earlier, cerebral cortex is the part of the brain where information is processed, stored, and retrieved and interpreted. And for some animals, it seems like they don't have much of an attention span. Well, it's not really their fault because maybe they just don't have the brain capacity. Some animals are quicker at learning. Some animals seem to have very little ability to learn. And that has to do with, to some degree, their brain capacity. So here's a quick review of a couple of the sensory processing pathways, just to kind of give you an idea of how those pathways work, like where do they go. So if you look on the left-hand side, I know this doesn't make sense, but that's supposed to be a tongue. And what we're seeing here on this is that taste information or gustatory information is passed first into the tongue, and then it moves through a neurological pathway that goes directly through the brainstem and through the thalamus, through the old part of the brain, and then outward toward the temporal lobe. So if you remember from one of the previous slides, some of that information that we have is in that temporal lobe, crossing over into the left parietal lobe of the brain that helps us to interpret taste information. On the other hand, if we look at the nose here, that information is processed through a similar pathway. It goes through a very similar pathway here in the brain. And as we talked about earlier, how I mentioned that senses of smell and taste are closely linked, you can kind of see that in this pathway here, how those two pathways are it's almost like they're sharing the same highway. And so smell information actually turns the corner here and is processed in this kind of deeper area of the temporal lobe underneath. And what's not shown in this photo is the pathway where it would go through the olfactory bulb there. Okay, so if we're looking on this side, on the right side, what we're seeing here is mechanoreceptors, which are neurological pathways that are responsible for movement and touch, and then the nociceptors or nociceptors, which are responsible for interpreting pain signals. So as you can see, those two pathways are also interconnected. Sometimes if you kind of look in there, you can kind of see these little lines where they're sort of connected to each other without going to the brain first. Sometimes that is the case, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But for the most part, these pathways go right into the central core of the brain, the oldest part of the brain that is responsible for interpreting, things like our awareness, our ability to physically respond to hazards or threats. And then after that actually goes through that part of the brain, then we have this part of the brain up here, which again is processing that information and making sense out of it. So think of it this way. Maybe if you're walking down the sidewalk and you accidentally step on a tack, and that tack goes through your flip-flop and punctures the bottom of your foot, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to pick up your foot in pain because that information has not quite reached the brain yet. But this is actually a protective aspect of having the pain receptors and mechanoreceptors linked together at an earlier part of the sensory pathways, because that's a protective feature. It wouldn't make much sense if we had to think about what's hurting us before we reacted, right? So that's what this is for, is so that our body can react to pain or danger without us having to think about it. But at some point, there is a parallel process that happens in the brain where the oldest part of our brain might activate our emotions like, oh my gosh, I just hurt myself, now I'm freaked out, or I'm scared of that loud sound. And then our mind will take a look and think, what just happened, right? So all of these processes are happening at the same time. And as you can see, these pathways are connected to each other, which is, of course, an evolutionary advantage. Okay, guys, same thing here. We're going to look at the sensory pathways. I'm going to try to keep it a little bit shorter this time. But as you can see, the optic nerve filters information through the back of the eye into the old part of the brain, which helps to activate our memory and our emotions and things that we're seeing. And then after it passes through that area, um, our mind starts to make sense out of what that information is in the primary visual cortex here in the back of the brain. One of the things that I think is interesting is that if you'll notice right here in the center of the brain, why do you guys think that the optic nerve would have some level of ending in this old part of the brain where there might be things like emotional regulation or survival instincts and things like that, and why that might come actually before we our brain is able to understand what that information is. I just want you guys to think about that. Same thing here for hearing. If you take a look here, this is actually what the inner ear looks like. And it's connected to both the vestibular nerve, which as we know is responsible for balance and kind of like gravity orientation. So we know which way is up, which way is down, and so forth. And then the cochlear nerve, which again is for interpreting auditory information. Again, we have all of this information being processed in these different pathways all at the same time. And if you notice, some of the sensory pathway from the ear actually is directly linked to the cerebellum, which is responsible for voluntary movement. And I want you guys to come up with some hypotheses and think about why that might be. It should be pretty straightforward, but I want you to really think about it. Same thing here. Auditory and vestibular feelings are processed in the old part of the brain, which activate, those older functions that all animals have, which is fear and excitement and regulating our heartbeat, regulating our sweat, digestive processes, things like that. And then at the same time, that's being processed in the cerebral cortex. So we have a chance to sort of think about what that information is. Okay, so this slide, I don't want to take too much time to, pick apart all these little pieces of it, but this is just an example of how stimulus from our environment enters the body through different pathways, through different parts of the brain. And if you were paying attention to the last maybe 2 or 3 slides, you'll kind of see how that works for different sensory organs. But at the end of all of this, there has to be some type of response to that stimuli. So again, like I mentioned in the previous couple of slides, I want you guys to really be thinking about why there are multiple routes that get us to a particular behavioral response or emotional response to a specific stimuli. Why does that make sense? Does it have an evolutionary advantage? And if so, what is that evolutionary advantage? Okay, so what I want you guys to get out of this final slide is just to have an appreciation for the ultimate function and purpose of the brain, which is to keep us alive. Our brain is there to maximize the potential of our internal organs, help maximize the efficiency of our brains. It does a really good job of filtering out information and non-essential stuff so that we can focus on things that are important, survival processes, for example. And then also, the brain is really good at fast tracking information in ways that are going to promote survival as well. Like, for example, in one of the earlier slides where I talked about how sometimes if you hear a loud noise, you're going to jump and have this sort of startle reaction. The purpose of that is, from an evolutionary standpoint, is to help protect us against some type of danger. So we're already reacting to a sound and ready for fight or flight before our mind has really grasped what is that's going on. And again, that has to do with how the brain has evolved to stay alive. So at the end of the day, all of these really complex processes, I want you guys to really think about this stuff. try to understand it in the context of what it does for us in terms of overall survival, and hope you have a great day. Thanks.